So we're currently exploring the 7 factors of awakening through a 4-week series. And last week, Larry started us off with an overview and then an exploration of the first factor, which is mindfulness. And if you missed last week's talk, you can access it on the Sangha's website. Tonight, I'll be addressing the second and the third factors. These are investigation and energy. And then the remaining 4 factors will be covered over the next 2 weeks. So I'd like to start with a quick review of these 7, just so that we can kind of refresh ourselves as to where tonight's topic fits in. So can folks see that? So the 7 factors, the first one is considered foundational and a balancing factor. That's mindfulness. After that, there are 3 energizing factors, investigation and energy, which are the 2 I'll be covering tonight. And then a 3rd energizing factor of joy. And then there are 3 calming factors, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So that's kind of where our topic tonight fits into the landscape. So the awakening factors are wholesome mental qualities that incline the mind toward awakening. And these contrast with the 5 hindrances, which are unwholesome mental qualities that obstruct our progress on this path to awakening. Now, sometimes we hear the complaint that the Buddhist teachings are too negative, that we talk too much about suffering and obstacles. And so these awakening factors are the positive, affirming counterpoint to the negative teaching on the hindrances. And the Buddha even referred to them as anti-hindrances. When I first began working with the awakening factors, I didn't quite get it. They seemed to me like a random collection, and they didn't necessarily have a natural connection to one another. And over time, I've come to appreciate that there, in fact, are connections among them. And they do correspond to progress on this path. There's a logical flow. Now, as Larry said last week, the 7 factors are also understood not just to be 7 independent factors, but to represent a progression from the 1st through the 7th. And each one flows naturally from the one before. And again, I'll say that my initial impression was that this progression was somewhat contrived. I thought, well, you can take any 2 words and try to cobble together a connection between them, but it didn't really seem true to me. But over the years, as I've practiced with these 7 factors, I think there is a very logical progression. So you'll just have to see what you find for yourself as you practice with the 7 factors. So in his book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, Bhante Gunaratna addresses this progression. And as to mindfulness, the first factor, he says, with strengthened mindfulness, the wholesome desire arises to investigate impartially every experience you have. So notice the connection there. Mindfulness generates the desire to investigate. Factor 1 leads to factor 2. And then he continues, as everything you investigate continues to reveal the truth, zeal arises to see more. The mind is filled with energy. So there, what he's saying is investigation, factor 2, generates energy, factor 3. So if these factors don't seem like they're a coherent collection to you, or if it doesn't seem like there's a natural progression, my suggestion is just hold that as an open question. Consider that it's a possibility. It's a suggestion from a wise teacher. I'm not referring to me, I'm referring to the Buddha. And work with them in your own practice and see what you find. So let's move on to tonight's two factors. The first being investigation. So other terms you will hear for this factor are investigation of dhammas, different term, discrimination, and discernment. And as we hear these terms, it begins to reveal kind of a shared thread of looking carefully and making wise distinctions. So in his essay, The Seven Factors of Enlightenment, Payadasi Tara says, the second enlightenment factor is the sharp analytical knowledge of understanding the true nature of all constituent things, animate or inanimate, human or divine. It is seeing things as they really are, seeing things in their proper perspective. Systematic reflection comes naturally through right mindfulness, and it urges one to discriminate, to reason, and investigate. Now I'm going to circle back to that last sentence again. He's using the term systematic reflection, which equates to investigation. Systematic reflection comes naturally through right mindfulness. Again, there's the progression. The second factor of investigation has arisen because of the first factor, mindfulness. Now, the primary distinction that's called for by this activity of investigation is that which is wholesome or skillful for progress on the path versus that which is unwholesome or unskillful. In his book, Mindfulness, Joseph Goldstein discusses this distinction, and he offers the following. Mindfulness brings us face to face with arising states. The wisdom factor of investigation then illuminates the states themselves and discerns the difference between the two. That is, the difference between wholesome and unwholesome. We apply investigation to discern wholesome versus unwholesome. Investigation is understood to be closely related to the development of wisdom on the path, which is one component of the Eightfold Path. And just to restate Joseph Goldstein's words again, mindfulness brings us face to face with arising states, the wisdom factor of investigation. So there's this connection between the second factor of investigation and wisdom. It is also, the second factor is also in direct opposition to doubt, and that's the fifth of the five hindrances. Now, if you don't have the hindrances memorized, that's okay. You don't have to know all that. But just to understand that the hindrances, the negative collection, and the awakening factors, the positive collection, this one, investigation, is understood to be in opposition to doubt, one of the negative components. So I talking about investigation and wholesome versus unwholesome, I recently found my mind occupied by an encounter with a friend, and we disagreed about a decision that we needed to make together. And I found her approach to our decision-making disturbing in any number of ways. And this was consuming my attention. And when I investigated the situation in the context of wholesome versus unwholesome, what I saw was that my reactivity had an unwholesome origin. It was essentially an ego need presenting itself. And once I could see that, it enabled me to relinquish this emotional charge around this interaction. And then I could look at the decision without that emotional overlay. And in that context, we were able to negotiate a decision we were both happy with. But the key for me was using investigation to identify and remove this strong emotional overlay, which was grounded in the defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion. Practically speaking, it can sometimes be confusing as to whether or not a particular line of inquiry is appropriate during our meditation. So, is it wise to explore it, or should I just come back to the breath? Should I drop it and come back to the breath? The answer, it's not always clear cut, and sometimes it changes as the experience unfolds, but the ability to discern the answer to this question grows over time. And the key is whether or not the object is associated with progress on the path. So let's just say, let's make sure this will be practical for you in your meditation practice. I'm guessing everybody has encountered situations where our thoughts of some pressing matter have interrupted our focus in meditation. Maybe you are meditating and you gain a really useful insight, but it's about a mundane matter in your life. Important, but mundane. It's not about progress on the path. And you might feel pulled to further investigate this because you want to resolve this issue, and it feels like maybe there's a clue here. So absent a connection to progress on the path, that investigation of that particular item would not be the right choice. You would want to leave that for later. On the other hand, if a matter presents itself and it is related to the Dhamma, then it is fine to let the mind undertake investigation. As a matter of fact, it's not just fine to do it. That is one of the purposes of meditation. So to not do it would be to fail to reap the benefits, the fruits of the seeds that you've sown through your meditation practice. Sometimes an investigation into a Dhamma matter will morph into something that's very mundane. So really what we have to do, the suggestion is just be continually vigilant while you're doing investigation during meditation. And if the focus shifts, just return your attention back to your chosen object. So that's a little bit about investigation. Now, the other factor I want to talk about tonight is energy. The third of the awakening factors. Another term you might hear used for this is persistence. So most of us are familiar with variable levels of energy during meditation practice. Sometimes it shows up as a really low level of energy. Frequently, it can be sleepiness or dullness. And it can also manifest as the absence of the diligence needed to even practice. We might have so little energy around our practice that we don't even sit down. So this awakening factor is understood to have a close connection to the sixth factor on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is right effort. Again, if you don't have the Noble Eightfold Path memorized, that doesn't matter. What matters is just understanding that the path includes a path factor of right effort, and this energy factor is closely related to that. It's in direct opposition to sloth and torpor, which is the third of the five hindrances. And I want to take just a moment and clarify something there. If we just talk about energy level, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, sometimes the energy level's too high, my mind's distracted, sometimes it's too low, and my mind is kind of lazy and dull. In the context of the awakening factors, energy is only dealing with low energy. The issue of high energy is related to tranquility, which is the fifth of the seven awakening factors, and that'll be addressed next week. So what I'm talking about here is not both high and low energy, but predominantly low energy. So cultivating energy is a task that we must apply ourselves to. So again, this is from Payadasi Thera. The Buddha is only a path revealer and not a savior who endeavors to save souls by means of a revealed religion. The idea that another raises a person from lower to higher levels of life and ultimately rescues her tends to make a person indolent and weak, supine and foolish. Don't mince your words. Others may lend us a helping hand indirectly, but deliverance from suffering must be wrought out and fashioned by each one for herself upon the anvil of her own actions. So one way we can experience low energy in our meditation practice is through dullness and sleepiness. I remember the first time I heard a question was posed about sleepiness, and the teacher responded by saying, well, you simply need to raise your energy level. And I was kind of shocked. It never occurred to me that I could make a decision to change my energy level. I didn't know that was true. I didn't believe that was true. I didn't understand that it was an act of will, could be an act of will. But after I got over my surprise, I tested it out on that retreat. And in fact, it was true. I could just make a decision to change my energy level. What a relief. Now, it doesn't always do the job. Sometimes it's more challenging than others, but it's a tool that you can use. Another thing that's true about low energy is that it can be the result of a lack of careful attention. When we're lost in dullness and sleepiness, it can feel hopeless. One way to be in relationship with that experience is to be only vaguely aware of it because we're feeling dull. And to the extent we are aware of it, we're just aversive to it. We're thinking, I don't want to be sleepy. I want to be meditating. But a more useful way to be in relationship with it is to take that dullness or that sleepiness as the object of our attention, just as we might any other mind state. What is the experience of sleepiness? What is it? Does it remind me of anything else? Where do I feel it in my body? And as we become curious about the sleepiness, the dullness, when we become interested in it, the attention naturally generates, guess what? Energy. So it's another example of investigation leading naturally to the next factor of energy. One more point I want to make about energy has to do with, so this is a quote from Joseph Goldstein again. The proximate cause for the arising of energy as a factor of enlightenment is the feeling of spiritual urgency. Now, the concept of spiritual urgency, the Pali word is samvega. It can be very motivating. Sometimes it can be seductive to just relax into a life, a fairly comfortable life, and not exert so much diligent effort. But when we cultivate awareness of spiritual urgency, we recognize that time is precious. one of the things we recognize is we have been born into this human plane of existence. Now, maybe you embrace the idea of rebirth and maybe you don't. It doesn't matter. Either way, we were born as humans. And the statistic that I saw is that humans represent 1/100th of 1% of the beings on this planet. So what that means is 1 of every 10,000 births on this planet is a human birth, and the other 9,999 are not. And only in this human form can we reach awakening. In addition, we live during a time when the Dhamma exists. Before the Buddha was here, there was no knowledge of the Dhamma. In addition, we live in a part of the world where it's available to us. We don't live in England in the 1400s where nobody knew about the Dhamma. And we live in a time when most of us can read. And we live in a time when the Dhamma is written down. That wasn't true when the Buddha was teaching. And we can read these things in our homes. We don't have to go to another country to find a book with them written down. And most of us have the luxury of time to study and practice. Most people on the planet are just trying to put food in their bellies and their family, a shelter over their head, make sure that they have clothing and that they're safe from danger. So when we remember what extremely rare good fortune we have, that creates a sense of samvega or spiritual urgency, and that can motivate us, that can give us energy toward our practice. Well, I'm out of time. I have a few more points that I wanted to make, but I'm not going to have time to do them tonight. I hope this has been a little bit useful looking at the second and third of the awakening factors. And I invite you to stay with this series for the next 2 weeks. And if you didn't hear Larry's talk last week, go find that recording and take advantage of that.